Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, the second in our storm season series in partnership with Queensland Government, Department of Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning and RACQ Get Ready Queensland. My name is James Flaherty and I'm your facilitator for today. When storm and flood strikes, we all recall the pictures we see of business owners struggling to protect their IT systems and infrastructure. And today's webinar, in association with Sundata, will help you protect your IT resources during storm season. I'm delighted today to be joined by Kon Kakanis, the Managing Director of Sundata, one of Queensland's leading IT service providers, who has over 30 years experience and 15 years experience with disaster recovery and high availability systems. Before we start, some quick tips to get the most from today's session. We'll be on air for around 30 to 40 minutes, and following the main presentation there'll be a Q&A. So please do use the text boxes that you'll have on screen to send any questions through that you have to Kon. Following on from the session, we'll send out an email which will contain a copy of the webinar, the slides and additional information that will help you protect your systems during storm season. So Kon, without further ado, it's over to you to explain the things that businesses need to consider to protect their IT services during storm season.
Thank you, James. Thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon to everybody attending this afternoon. So my name's Kon Kakanis from Sundata, and I guess apart from my IT experience, I would add that in 2011 our business experienced a flood event, and a lot of our clients went through the high impact of floods as well. So quite apart from general discussion today, there's a lot of practical experience that's gone into the content that we'll go through today. I'll say up front, there's quite a bit of material here. It's a reasonably dense presentation because I'm trying to condense into 30 or 40 minutes a number of subject headings. Some of you may have attended a webinar on IT resilience I hosted earlier this year. Some of the material has come from that presentation, and some of the material is also, I guess, been made more specific to the sorts of challenges we find through the summer season. So today what we're about is in the wider context, understanding the impacts of IT failure on your business, and then maybe some of the things that you can do to reduce the risk and impact of events, storm season type events on your business, and then basically building a plan that you can go ahead and execute either with your own staff or with your IT service providers. In general, this subject falls into two categories. There's prevention and then there's remediation, and we'll sort of talk about both of those sorts of things. So IT resilience and how it applies to the summer environment. Well, IT resilience is where you deploy your systems so that they are effectively not affected by disruptions. And as I said, you do this by prevention, and then you do it by prevention, and then you also minimise impacts by recovery strategies or redundancy strategies. And that effectively, between those two, you've improved the resilience of your IT assets so they can better support your business regardless of disruption. Excuse me. So, many organisations find one of the hardest steps to take is to convince management to do something about building resilience into the environment. Some organisations it's actually led by the executive and they demand it, usually as a result of personal experience. In other situations, there's a she'll be right mate type attitude. So having a discussion about why do it is often important. So the gist of it is that, as we all experience, IT has become ubiquitous and it's been consumerised and it's been moved to a 24/7 environment. If I talk to you about internet banking, would you expect internet banking to switch off at 5 o'clock at night? Probably not. If I talk to you about Facebook or Instagram, would you expect that to not be there at 11 o'clock at night? Of course, it's always on. Business systems are heading that way as well. Mobility is affecting it. You know, we all reach for our smartphones and check email at the oddest times of day. Customers, especially if they're used to ordering via web portals, they do it when it suits them. It might be at 1 o'clock in the morning, it might be at 8 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes the contracts we have with our customers can mandate the sort of availability we've got to deliver, particularly if you're working with some of the largest supermarket chains, for example. It can actually be in your contracts. So why build resilient systems? It's so that you can continue to perform regardless of what setbacks you've got. And in the context of the summer environment, they're the classic Queensland headlines: lightning, thunder, hail, you know, the full catastrophe. So that's the sort of environment we're dealing with here. So this slide here effectively outlines a process. So I've got 5 steps, so you can call it a 5-step process if you like, and we'll go through these in a bit more detail as we go through. So the first thing is to actually define what are we actually trying to protect ourselves against. So I've got there stormwater, flood, lightning, reduced access. The other one obviously is power. The reduced access one may not be obvious always, but if you've been in a situation like this, your business or your premises might be completely untouched and completely pristine. But if your access to those premises has been affected because an access road has been flooded, then your business is affected and you can't actually operate. So even though you're not flooded, you might need the ability to have your staff working from home, and you might need the ability to have access to systems, whether they're on your premises or whether they're somewhere else. So for each of these threats or risks that you want to reduce the risk of, there's I guess some questions to ask yourself in your business about your objectives in relation to mitigating these risks. We'll go through those as well. Once you've done that, you've actually got effectively a prioritised list, and you can start to build the resilience of your system to match these business objectives. So there's some of the things I'll step through: hardening, the capacity of your systems, the knowledge that your people have got about what to do in certain situations, the leveraging of technology to make things seamless so people don't actually notice if a problem's occurred, and then processes around decisions and activities that have to happen if you do actually have one of these risk factors take hold. So once you've built your resilience, there's a process to validate that you can actually deliver on the promise to the business, which is important for obvious reasons. And then once you've done that, what can you do to automate or productionise this ability to mitigate these risks? And by that it means taking out individuals' recollection of what to do out of their head and either automate it or document it or make it so it's a repeatable process with less risk and less issues. So that's a high level of what the process looks like. So again, just to help with convincing management that you need to do something, I've got just a couple of little case studies that we've seen over the last few years. This one happened about 2 years ago. As a national organisation, had a production environment and had a completely identical high availability environment, so 2 identical systems. And the agreement inside the business was that if the production environment failed, then the whole national network had to be up and running within 2 to 3 hours on the second system. So it was a Monday evening, the primary system failed and all hands on deck, and the whole network was running on the second system within 3 hours, so it was pats on the back all around. The business continued to transact, invoicing wasn't affected, deliveries weren't affected, everybody was very happy. Now the quirk was that because of the nature of the hardware failure on the first system, it took 4 days to bring everything back online. And by back online, I meant where we had 2 systems, a production and a disaster system. Because it took 4 days, the CEO almost sacked the IT manager, told him that he'd failed in his duty and that his performance was unacceptable. This actually illustrates that a disaster situation or an outage for a business is extremely stressful and extremely emotive. And one of the things I'll actually touch on is how to mitigate the risk of people moving the goalposts when you're halfway through a disaster, because it is actually something that does happen. Second little case here. This was a business that is at headquarters at Rocklea in Brisbane. Before the 2011 floods, they had a real battle with the board and finally got about $250,000 approved to build a redundant environment to run their core system. Unfortunately, in January 2011, the floods did encroach on their head office to the point where it went completely underwater. Before the water got into the building, the client was able to switch all their systems over to their secondary system, which was at South Brisbane. And so the business continued to operate through the flood event and all the cleanup afterwards, which if you were there, you might remember it's probably 2 or 3 weeks of mess and cleanup and before things sort of settled back down in Brisbane. After the event, probably a couple of months later, there was a board meeting and it came back down to the IT people that the board had minuted that was the best money they'd ever spent in the business. So without that, they were looking down the barrel of somewhere between 2 and 6 weeks of systems being out of action just because of the nature of the damage. But they effectively went through without a hiccup. So that's the opposite case. Before the event, nobody wanted to do it. After the event, they said they couldn't have lived without it. So I'll come back to those 5 steps I talked about. And really the process of defining these risks or threats is I guess I could most correctly describe it as a collaborative process inside the business. It's typically not successful if one person locks himself in a room with a double strength flat white and writes a document and then presents it back to everybody else. This is a collaborative process because at the end of the day, you're looking to release funds and resources to build this resilience, which is a financial approval process or a budget process. So you need sign on from the finance and you need sign on from the executive leadership of the business. So the sorts of questions, and you can do this in a workshop or you can do it just by walking around, but the sorts of questions you might ask, what happens if lightning strikes our building? What sort of risk profile have we got for power failure? Are we in a reliable grid or are we in a grid that's always struggling with reliability of power delivery? What's our exposure from floodwaters? What sort of peak rain events do we get? That's, if you like, asking the questions about nature. Then you can move on to the consequential questions which relate to your systems. So say we've had a lightning strike and our phone system fails. What percentage of our orders come in via the phone? If it's 10%, then you might be able to live with it. If it's 70%, then you probably need to plan for what happens if our phone system fails. How do we handle no internet or email? We all love it when email switches off, and if we go on holidays and switch off email, it's an actual blessed moment. But the reality is that if email fails in a business, there's an extremely short window of tolerance, like 5 to 10 minutes before people start screaming. So if because of an external event we've lost email, that can be a real issue, and your business's tolerance for that needs to be understood, because that's what you can only address that requirement if you know what it is. One thing that we have seen when systems are out, and this particularly relates to email, is you might need to contact all your staff. So this happened in 2011. I saw this happen with organisations. You need to contact all your staff. Your email server's down because the UPS went for 2 hours and then it died and you didn't get power back for 2 days. No mail server. How do we contact staff? Oh, well, everybody's got perhaps a private email address like a Yahoo or a Gmail or a Hotmail. Okay, where's that list? Oh, it's on the server as well. Oh. So contingency are things like hard copies or having copies of the private email addresses, home phone numbers, private mobile numbers stored in a separate environment. And you might say, well, I could put that on Dropbox. Okay, that's great. So you're at home and you want to access Dropbox, but hey, what? There's no power at home. Okay, so I can't actually access the internet from home either. So they're the sorts of, that's the consequence, the sort of the cascading questions that you might ask. Now the answer might be that you print the directory of your staff off, you laminate it, and you give copies to all your senior executives, and they take it home and it sits in the kitchen. It's not always, you know, a high-tech response to these sorts of things. Sometimes it's a simple response. Then you can drill down even further into your operational systems. What are the consequences? For example, if we can't print invoices or manifests or pick lists, if we can't do a pay run, what are the consequences? And that's the discussion you have internally. Something like payroll might be easy because you just use last month's pay sheets. Something like manifests, well, that's more critical because that's related specifically to the orders that you got last night. If you can't get to those, then you can't print a manifest. So what do? You might have a fallback of a standard order that you fall back on, and you ship those to your customers just to tide them over. And, you know, again, what we find is if you're communicating to your customers through these sorts of processes, they are far more tolerant and understanding than you might give them credit for. So that's a process of asking questions inside the business to try and understand the consequences of an outage. And this is not just related to storm season. This applies to any threat like antivirus or malicious behaviour or anything like that. So secondly, process of setting your objectives, your business objectives. And I've got two points here. I've got a recovery time objective and a recovery point objective. So for each system, so for example, invoicing, payroll, email, and so on, you can look at the recovery time objective, which is how long before we get this system back. You might say email's got to be back in 2 hours, the website's got to be back within half a day, and payroll's got to be back within 24 hours. They're normal, typical, but they are unique to your business. So for your key systems, how long before we want to get them back? And this will feed in down the track to how you design your failover environment or your redundancy or your resilience strategies. The recovery point objective, this relates to the data point that you come back at when you turn the thing back on. It might be last night's backup, it might be the last email sent before the outage, or it might be the last order that was taken before the outage. Again, it's specific to your systems and your business, so an outsider like me can't answer it. You have to ask these questions yourself and answer them internally. These are not IT questions, these are business questions. Once you understand your recovery time and recovery point objectives for your key systems, then you can start to filter that down into what does that mean for my IT systems like the internet, my emails, ERP server, my electricity supply, my backup tapes, all of those sorts of things. So I've got some examples on that page there of the sort of conversation. So internet, for example, if all of your orders come in via the web and if a customer can't place an order, they go to your competition, well, no outage is really tolerable. So you need redundancy in those links. And you might even make it redundant to the point that your primary link is, say, with one telco, and your secondary link is with another one because you don't want all your eggs in one basket. Power, a lot of people depend on their UPSs and think that'll get them out of it. We do find that that's not always the case, but everybody can define at least a short window of how much power they need, hoping that the mains will come back. I mentioned private email addresses. You can have strategies for redirecting your switchboard to your mobile. These are all the sorts of system decisions you've got to make once you understand how quickly you want to recover. So step 3 then, building resilience. So we've identified a whole bunch of risks and we understand the implications, which now allows us to prioritise these risks. So you might say, for example, our website, which takes all our orders, that's the highest priority to protect, or it might be another element of your environment. Once you prioritise the risk, the first step to do, which I'll touch on shortly, is site hardening, which can be surprisingly simple and cheap and give you surprisingly big benefits. You've also got to look at processes, so people understand what to do if they have to use a secondary system, or indeed if they have to fall back to a manual set of processes. The last thing you want, if you've had a, I don't know, something like a hailstorm, you've had windows smashed in, you've got water pouring into the office. You may have some people running around like chooks with their heads cut off, and you may have other people very calm, and you may have other people who go missing in action. So having a clear expectation for what is to happen in that situation helps avoid that volatility of behaviour. I will point out, I've seen this, it's a stressful, very emotive time. People behave in all sorts of unpredictable ways. So the more that you can do to eliminate that risk of that volatility, the better outcome you'll get. So moving down that chain, single points of failure are really the hot spots for building resilience. If you can eliminate your single points of failure and have effectively multiple pathways through your systems, then that goes a long way to building a resilient environment. One thing you have got, if you've got multiple points, is to understand when something's failed, because sometimes things can fail and you may not actually realise it. So you might have two firewalls, one's failed, the business is still happily going along until you get to a peak load, and then you realise. So monitoring and detection of failure so that you can actually recover from that is a key element. And then if you've got redundant systems, say a primary and a secondary server, the ability to move the workload from one to the other has to be a repeatable process rather than something that depends on black magic and fairy dust. The last thing you want is to have to ring one of your staff who's on holidays because they're the only ones who remember how to do it, or they're the only ones with the password. So you need a process that's repeatable. Another part of resilience is to make sure that your duplicate systems have got the capacity to handle the workload. A very common pattern that we see is, for example, a server gets replaced. So the old server is kept, and the thinking is, oh, well, if we have a problem with the primary one, then the old one can do the job. That sometimes can work. What we often see is those older systems get out of date very quickly, operating systems are mismatched, or software versions are different, or they're actually not tested very often, or there's an assumption that they can be brought back online in a day, but really it takes 4 or 5 days. So understanding whether your redundant systems have got the capacity to handle the extra workload is a key element. And then understanding exactly where you're at, how are our production systems working, are we monitoring these, do we know when something's failed, is it obvious, and how do we restore the situation? And the final one here, I'm talking about processes to assess the impact of a failure and to make a decision. This is really a business decision, and by that I'm talking about declaring a disaster where we actually invoke the extra resources. Typical scenario is you might have, say you have a lightning strike and you fried a component in your server. So you call the engineer, they come out and they say, yes, we can replace that. The part's coming up from Sydney, it'll be here in 4 hours or 6 hours. Or it's coming from the distribution centre at Archerfield, it'll be here in 2 hours. Well, is the 2 hours okay with you? Or do you switch over to the other system now? Does the other system take 2 hours to switch over to, or can you do it in 20 minutes? They are often the sorts of fork in the road type decisions that you make during a disaster situation. It's, do we wait for the primary system to come back and be restored, or do we switch to our secondary system now? And for that you need reliable information about how long will it take to fix the initial outage. Right, so building resilience, so I mentioned site hardening before, and I mentioned that it can be quite simple. This is not an IT issue. This is a little bit about walking around with common sense. In the context of summer, rain, water is the typical one, and again, I certainly see this in the home environment: blocked drains, gutters, all sorts of things. You get a thunderstorm and all of a sudden the promise that you made to clean out the gutters is remembered, and you've got water coming down the walls, and it's all a drama. CCIQ here had a situation which James mentioned earlier. Any building that's more than probably 20 or 30 years old that's got a flat roof has probably got issues with the roof if it hasn't been replaced recently. So things like air conditioners that have been moved, old mounts, things like that, you end up with holes that may have been sealed up, the sealant lets go, the roofing gets a bit loose, the fastenings aren't quite right. So you end up with in a storm where you get 100 millimetres in half an hour, you could end up with water coming into your building. Your stormwater pipes or gutters might be full of leaves. You may have had some building work done at the ground level, and a drain may have been inadvertently filled with gravel or topsoil, so that if the rain comes, the water backs up. And water's a funny thing; it gets into all sorts of places. It can get into your power distribution, or it can just get into your general area. Site hardening involves walking around more from a building maintenance point of view than an IT point of view, and making sure that none of these issues are going to catch you out if you get heavy rainfall. I mentioned UPSs before. UPSs are electrified car batteries in a big case. They typically have a 2-year life, is what they're warranted for. You might get longer out of it. Typically, people find out the UPS is not working when they've had a power failure. So just when they need it, they realise the batteries are 5 years old and they're completely flat. Generators can be fickle things, especially if they're only fired up once a year. If they're diesel, diesel fuel can get contaminated, and the generator will start up and run, and it might run for 5 or 10 minutes, and then the filters get blocked, and then it stops. All those sorts of things are to do with site hardening. It's what can you do from a building perspective that will reduce or eliminate the risk of outages to do with storm or summer season type issues. So we've got our objectives in place. We've sort of prioritised a plan. We've done some site hardening. Testing of your ability to switch from one environment to another is one of the most overlooked elements of building IT resilience. So I apologise if this comes across as being simplistic, but we do see this all the time. So tape, the classic one is tape. Okay, we're okay because we back up. Okay, what does backing up to tape look like in a typical busy environment? Okay, well we put a tape in the drive at the end of the day, and somebody's got a job to take that tape out and put it in the safe, or drop it off somewhere on the way home. Sorts of things that happen. The tape backup's taking a bit longer. Somebody's got to catch a bus. The tape's left in the drive. Or it's supposed to go in the safe, but there was something in the way, or somebody's got an excuse. Or it's supposed to go home and be in the person's office at home, but it really doesn't make it off the front seat of the car. There are all sorts of things like this. And then what then happens is when you need to recover using that tape, it's not always complete, or it's not always reliable. Most backup software sends messages if a tape backup hasn't completed. It's very common that because those messages happen every day, people start ignoring them. So every day you get to work and there's an error message that says tape backup did not complete, delete, we'll be okay, won't happen to us, she'll be right. So there's some very basic fundamentals around tape that are often overlooked. Another fundamental assumption that's often untested is, oh well, if we have a failure, we'll just buy a new server and we'll rebuild it and we'll be back in no time. Well, people think no time is a day. The reality is, at best, it might take a day or two to get the new server if you don't already have it. And then, with the environment that people run today with software and the complexity of that, you're probably looking at more like 3 or 4 days to get it into production than a day. Until this process is tested, it's really, really hard to make a promise to the business. So if we're going to do some testing, what I'd encourage you to do is to define what a successful test looks like before you start. It's quite easy to start a disaster recovery test, and sort of halfway through you get to a point and say, oh look, I think that's good enough, I'm okay with that. And the reality is that when it comes to the stressful real life situation, the process that you have not tested is the process that lets you down. So define a successful test result, and this again is something the business has to define. It's not an IT decision. It might be something as simple as the ability to print invoices in the warehouse. It might be executives being able to log in from home. There's any number of things that tell you that the business is ready to go again. The server coming back up is not a successful test. Printing invoices is a successful test. So at the end of this process, what you're looking for is the business, the managing director or the CFO or somebody who's got the accountability to actually sign off, and I would encourage this to be, via email or in writing, that the test results and what they deliver for the business is acceptable to the business in the case of a disaster. I have seen businesses move the goalposts on this issue during a disaster. So before a disaster, yep, 2 days is fine, 2 days is fine, 2 days is fine. Have a disaster, and once it gets past 2 hours, people are screaming for people's heads to roll. So if you've at least captured it somewhere in writing or in an email, then you've got some protection for when the business changes its mind, which is actually a risk in these sorts of environments. So final step, I talked about productionising and automating, and by this what I'm really getting at is getting away from the situation where you're depending on one person with a fantastic memory. And again, I know IT's got a reputation for lots of things being done by geeks who've got all the knowledge in their head and they don't share it and they don't talk and all that sort of stuff. But the reality is you don't want a key person to be a single point of failure, just like you don't want a server or a router or a firewall to be a key point of failure, single point of failure. So you can use software to automate the process, make it more repeatable. You can actually educate the business to schedule a failover test, whether it's once a year, once every 6 months, into the business calendar. You really want to have management and users signing up for this process, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who'll benefit the most from it. I guess if you are more and more sophisticated, then you can actually look at swapping between production and DR on a regular basis. And actually, if they're similar capacity, your DR system can be the production system for 3 months, and then 3 months later you change back. And I've seen people do that, and that really, really does make the failover bulletproof. So a couple of things. If you're looking for a checklist, here's a couple of things that you might want to do. The UPS. Go back and look at the invoice. When did you buy the UPS? How old are the batteries? UPSs have usually got lights or something that'll tell you whether the batteries are in good shape, or you can call the people who provide the maintenance for your UPS and just get them to come and run a health check on it. Again, with UPSs, it might be something that you bought 2 years ago, and your environment since then, you may have added staff or added systems. So what was okay 2 years ago to run the business for a couple of hours might now only have 45 minutes capacity. So there's a couple of things to check to do with your UPS. If you've got a generator, do you remember where it is? Is it, if it's a portable one? Has somebody taken it home because they went camping? If it's a bigger one that's in the building, do we remember how to start it? Where are the keys? Is it in a locked room? Who's got the key to the padlock? How long since it was serviced? How long since we checked the fuel? There's any number of sorts of checks that you can do for your generator. Communications. If you are highly dependent on your internet connections or your connection into the cloud, is redundancy a key element? If it is, have you got dual links? Are they with a single provider or two providers? Downstream from the links, have you got any single points of failure? So your links come into the business, you've got a firewall, you've got routers, you've got switches. Any of those single point of failure? If it is, then something as simple as a lightning strike. If it takes out your firewall, then your connection to the outside world's gone until you get a new firewall. I mentioned the site hardening with the building. Look at your drains, your roof leaks, window leaks. You know, the office that I'm in, the building's 13, 14 years old. A couple of windows have leaked since day one. Doesn't matter what you do. I appreciate it doesn't matter what you do. Sometimes you can't stop this happening. But what you can do is make sure key resources are not next to the leak, at least. Trees is another one. I haven't mentioned those. Overhanging trees. They can come in through a window. They can come down onto a roof. So maintaining, trimming, pruning trees is as much of an element of protecting your IT, as odd as it sounds, as any of these other strategies that we've spoken about. Are you in an area that's prone to flood? And we've seen with insurance that there's stormwater flood, and then there's flood which comes up through the drains. You might be okay for one, but not the other. You know, at the very least, a simple thing that you can do with server or communications equipment is get it higher up. A phone system, for example, if you've got a traditional PABX type system, it's probably mounted on a wall somewhere, maybe in a server room or the back of the kitchen or something like that. You know, should it be higher? Simple questions like that. Backups, I've mentioned how much faith people put in their tape backup and sometimes get found out. Testing recovery is the critical element here, and it doesn't matter whether you're backing up to tape, whether you're taking a snapshot of data and just keeping it on other disk, whether you're backing it up to the cloud. Whichever of those tactics you've got, being able to recover is the real proof of the pudding. And without a recovery test that's successful, you've really just got your fingers crossed. So, moving on a little bit further, when you want to come to work out how to pay for all this, you probably need a business case. So, again, I alluded to this sort of thing before. You go back to your business processes like orders, your website, your warehouse, picking a dispatch, invoicing. What are the systems that support these? And you've got the list there of the sorts of elements. Understand what your RTO and RPO is for those. And then once you've got an understanding of how quickly you want to recover and to what point you want to recover, you can start to look at what investment you need to make. There's an example there of a couple of business processes, and then in this case it's the internet connection and the ERP server. So the solution here is to duplicate your telco connection, different providers which I've alluded to, firewalls, and a redundant ERP system. How do we turn this into a project plan? Well, once you've got your costs and your priorities in place, the business needs to decide on the sequence of improvement. And then I would really encourage people not to try and boil the ocean on this. Each area of improvement becomes a project in itself. And, you've got decisions to make. Should we do it on-premise? Should we put it into the public cloud? Or do we do a hybrid cloud solution? And then you obviously budget it, build a plan, carry out, and as I said before, if you're not testing your failover capacity, then you really have just got your fingers crossed. These can all be done by internal staff or your suppliers. Some things can be done in parallel, others in sequence, and that again comes back to your priority list. And then as you've brought all these pieces of the puzzle together, you effectively need to do a full new test plan to test across more complex scenarios that combine things like your website, your ERP, your network, all of those sorts of things. So, almost there, and I again apologise for the density of the presentation. There's been a lot that we've covered. The business objectives are critical. If you dive into this and thinking about, well, we should do this for that IT component without understanding the business objectives, you run the risk of wasting time and money. Don't boil the ocean. Break the project down into achievable bite-sized chunks that you can easily budget, do and swallow. The business is the arbiter of the sequence here, because the business has to decide what are the most important systems to protect. And then finally, sorry, not finally, next, this is a foundational approach. There's not a lot of point in making your software resilience more fancy if the servers or the network aren't up to scratch. So your network is the foundation, and then your server and storage infrastructure, and then you add your applications on top of that. So there is an element of sequencing there. Some of the stuff you're looking at might be coming at end of life, so the budget for replacing something end of life might actually get you free IT resilience, because you can actually incorporate resilience into the replacement. And then again, the perpetual question, do I do it on premise? Do I host my own assets in another facility, or do I actually use a cloud offering? And again, what we're seeing in the marketplace, it's not one cloud. It's very much the minority of people who are moving everything to a single cloud service provider. What most people are doing are picking the eyes out of the cloud. So for example, they might keep their ERP on-premise, and they might have Office 365 as a cloud email offering, for example. And again, that's unique to every business. Final point there, I mentioned it before, an untested plan is not a plan, it's fingers crossed. So that's about it. If you want to take this discussion further, based on what we've discussed this afternoon, we can certainly help. This is a key part of our business. I'm happy to continue this discussion one-on-one with any attendees, and I'm happy to come to your office and spend a couple of hours with your executive team and just run you through this process to the point where you'll have some outcomes that you can then use yourself with your staff or your service providers, or if you want to engage us to help you implement a plan, that's certainly okay with us. So at the end of this exercise, you should have an agreement from your executive team on the priorities, and you should have a table of priorities for the business that you can go ahead and implement. So that's it for me. I think I'll hand back now to James. If there's any questions, we can just take them on the fly now.
Fantastic, thanks Con. Look, certainly a lot of food for thought for everybody listening today. And look, you do believe as a business that this will never happen to you. And one of the things I would suggest that anybody on today does is, following on today's session, jump onto CCIQ's Facebook page, facebook.com/CCIQLD, and have a look at the video, because we had water coming in through the roof. We had staff stood with umbrellas, holding them over their computers as the deluge poured in. You can bet your life since then we have put a complete disaster recovery plan into place that ensures that we can work remotely, we can access our data when we need it, we can keep our call center operating to service our members as we can, because you know a lot of our business is around the employer assistance and the employer advice, and you can also understand that when there are issues with businesses that have to close and hold staff off for you know, because of the result of a storm event, they phone us, and if we can't be there to service them, then our business falls apart pretty quickly. So have a look at that video, because it's a great reminder as to why having a disaster recovery plan for your business is essential. Time now for questions. Please do send them through on the text box that you have on screen. We've had some come through. First question, Con, is we have an employee taking a backup tape home every night. Is this enough to protect a business?
That's a good question. It's a very common scenario. You go back to the objective. The objective is to protect the data, so that if you do have a problem on your system, that you've got something that you can recover from. So an employee taking the tape home can cover a wide range of scenarios, from leaving it on the dashboard and the tape gets cooked by the morning sun every morning, or it's left on the kitchen table, dog ate it. It's unlikely to go into a fireproof safe. So in general, if it's critical data to your business, I'd have a really hard think about whether that's good enough. There are a number of service providers around town who will pick up a tape from your premises, and they will take it and they will store it in a fireproof secure facility on a nightly basis. I think the taking home thing was probably good 10 years ago, but I think a lot of people have moved past that now.
Next question we had in is one that comes through on a number of occasions. Is the cloud safe, and particularly safe for business critical data as we're talking about today?
Look, first point there is that the cloud is not one thing, right? The cloud is a gazillion service providers of different standards and different quality. So it is not one amorphous mass. So you've probably got to look at it specific to your service provider and the quality of their service and the confidence that they can give you. The other thing that I would suggest you need to think about with having a copy of your data in the cloud is what does it look like to get it back to the business? Unfortunately, the cloud experience, a lot of the hype that we see or the information that we read comes out of the US. And in the US, there's one fundamental difference to Australia, and that is that their equivalent of the NBN is very fast and very cheap. We don't have the speed, and we don't have the bandwidth, and we don't have the pricing. So moving data back and forth to the cloud can be expensive, and it can be slow. So again, it comes back to the point I made about testing. If you are keeping a copy of your data in the cloud, at some point you really need to test how long will it take and how much will it cost me, because sometimes there's charges associated with getting it back, and there's also your your pipe costs to get it back as well. So they're things to check out. And then as far as the safety goes, it really comes down to you assuring yourself about your specific provider.
Next question we've had in is it expensive to implement such IT changes and disaster recovery processes? Can small businesses afford to do so?
Look, I've seen people spend extremely small amounts of money to toughen their systems up, and I've seen people spend exorbitant amounts of money. I know that there was a very large national organisation 3 years ago that had an outage on their systems in Sydney, and it was expected the outage would take 2 hours to fix, and it took something like 28 hours. And as a result of that, they canned their contract with that provider, and at the cost of something like $400,000, they moved to a new provider. That's at the high end if you're a national organisation. If you're a small business, you're talking about typically, a small number of servers. To build resilience or redundancy is not expensive, and you've got to remember, hardware just gets cheaper and cheaper. It's a bit like plasma TVs. The $5,000 plasma TV of a few years ago is now $800, and to a large degree, servers and storage have followed the same sort of curve. So you may have looked at it a couple of years ago, and if you thought then it was too expensive, it might be worth looking at again, because, as I said, equipment's getting cheaper, but secondly, as the cloud service provider market gets more mature, the pricing is settling down, it's getting more aggressive, and you might find that there's options for backing up to the cloud or having failover to the cloud that are more competitive than what they might have been a year or two ago. So it's a moving target. And again, it comes back to what are your business objectives? What are you trying to protect? If it's valuable, then there's usually a business case there.
And look, just to echo that point, CCIQ, we're a small business. There's 23 of us, and we asked ourselves one simple question, and that was, what's the data that we have worth to us as a business? And the reality is the data that we have is worth everything to us. It is our business. If we don't have our data, our membership information, our contact details for all of our members across the state, we don't actually have a business. And that's the questions that I'd sort of say as a business owner to ask yourself simply is what can my business do if my systems don't work? And it very quickly puts into perspective some of the costs that you may be thinking about. And again, from CCIQ's perspective, our changes were not massively expensive at all. They were well within the reach of a small business, and it came back to the fact that our business plan stacked up because not having access to our systems meant our business couldn't run and operate, and it's a pretty simple way to think about it. Now, that's all the questions we've got time for today. please do send questions through to Kon. He's happy to have a conversation. Do seriously think about taking him up on that offer to come in and spend time with your team and talk to him and use his expertise to really go through how your business can potentially survive, the worst case scenario when a storm strikes. So thank you to Kon. Thank you for giving up your time today to come in and share your expertise with us. Thank you to everyone who attended today's webinar. Particular thanks to Queensland Government and the Department of Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning, and RACQ Get Ready Queensland for partnering with us for our storm season series and really helping us spread the message to small businesses across the state about how they need to ensure their businesses are resilient for when Queensland's weather does strike. For more information, you can visit cciq.com.au/storm season. There's a range of information on the site, such as free guides, fact sheets, and they're available for you to download. There's also a lot of additional resources aimed at small business that will help you mitigate the risk to your business during storm season. So thanks again for joining us on today's webinar. We look forward to welcoming you to another webinar in the future, and we hope that we've helped you today mitigate the risks for your business in the event that nature does strike over the summer. Thank you very much.